Hello, I'm Jorge Gestoso. Welcome to a new program. On today's show, President Donald Trump and his offensive against Venezuela. Our guest, James Early, former Director of Cultural Heritage Policy at the Smithsonian Institution and member of the board of the Institute for Policy Studies. James Early, a warm welcome to the program.
Thank you.
James, you have seen in recent days President Trump and his State of the Union address mentioning Venezuela.
And we condemn the brutality of the Maduro regime, whose socialist policies have turned that nation from being the wealthiest in South America into a state of abject poverty and despair.
Your reaction?
Well, let me just quote the Democratic Party and all of mainstream media. Donald Trump is a habitual liar, but a dangerous one. So we cannot look at his rhetoric and think that that is reality. He has betrayed members of his own Republican Party, for example, promising that he would support DACA if the wall would be supported, and when they presented him with a proposal, a bipartisan proposal supported by both Republicans and Democrats, he rejected it. So it's rhetoric, it's artistic rhetoric. It was full of misinformation, full of outright lies, but very, very dangerous, and particularly around the point of Venezuela.
Wall Street Journal, they published an article that are quoting a conversation between Mike Pence, the Vice President of the US, and Donald Trump. And Mike Pence says, President Trump is not really eager to do interventions around the world. And the quote is, with the exception of this hemisphere. And then in that article, the Wall Street Journal continues saying, after Venezuela, the next is Cuba, that we're going to impose more severe sanctions, including to restate again in the list of countries that sponsor terrorism, and the next one is Nicaragua. What's your reading?
That article is absolutely accurate, and it can be verified by the very statements of John Bolton, who is a right-winger, who has brought in Elliot Abrams, who is really a war criminal of the Ronald Reagan administration Iran-Contra affair. They are very blatant, they are very precise and very concise. They've stated that the Troika is Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. What they haven't said is Bolivia is also on that list.
Next.
2 days ago, John Bolton said, we hope
You're watching Telesur English. I'm Jose Daniel Lopez. We take you live to New York, where the Venezuelan Foreign Minister Jorge Gestoso is speaking after meeting the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Let's listen to him.
Venezuela is being very disrupted, and it's necessary there to have multilateralism in this case, to overcome any impact of unilateralism and thus cooperate, eagerly get cooperation, and even the state could also invest in projects that have been tailored by the United Nations, by its different agencies, for food, for health, for the needs of the people. The Secretary General has always been open and willing to do so, and he has gathered information about the political reality of Venezuela. He is happy to see Venezuela in peace. This has been an excellent meeting. You have spoken about this project of solving this with the United States in order to pressure the Secretary General to call elections in Venezuela and bring in humanitarian aid. We did not speak about these type of things. We were speaking about the structural topics and matters that are important for Venezuela, not about propaganda of the United States and their propaganda actions. We spoke about serious things. Thank you. Por favor, explíquenos qué es lo que usted mencionó.
This is the second meeting with the Secretary General this year, and we were talking about deepening, strengthening the cooperation of the agencies of the United Nations, the system of the United Nations in Venezuela, with more cooperation. You know that our economy has been damaged by foreign interventions, and of course we have always had the confidence, and we trust on multilateralism, we trust on the system of the United Nations in order to make positive things happen in Venezuela. So that is essentially what we spoke about. We gave him some information about the real picture of Venezuela at the moment, and there was a very good meeting, as it has always been, with the Secretary General Guterres.
Did you say why you didn't go to the Security Council meeting when it happened on January 20th?
We didn't speak about the Security Council nor of none of the actions of the U.S. Really, this was of important issues, not of propaganda from the U.S.
Are you going to go to the Federal Reserve Bank while you're here in New York? The issue that they've turned over the accounts to Guaido.
No. We have other ways, but not the Minister of Foreign Affairs.
We are Japanese media. Do you have any message for Japan?
For Japan, yes, of course. You know, we respect the Japanese people and the Japanese government, and we would really expect to receive the same treatment, for them to be balanced, to respect the Venezuelan sovereignty, to respect international law, and not to take sides with the U.S. when it is about Venezuela. So our best wishes for the Japanese people, for the Japanese government. You have a friend in Venezuela if you want to have friends in Venezuela. Thank you very much. Gracias.
Venezuelan Foreign Minister speaking after meeting with UN Secretary General. For this and more stories, go to our website, ofthe.net.
And the military at the top level has not broken with Maduro. But this will be a regional conflict. 8 military bases, U.S. military bases in Colombia, 2 armed groups, or at least the ELN in Colombia is still armed.
Some FLN.
And so FLN. So this could be a regional conflagration, a bloody one. And we must remember the period of the Condor, when the CIA and all of the dictators in Latin America, this is the reimposition of the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. And we should recall in the listening audience that in 1829, Simon Bolivar, who led the first liberations, successful liberations against colonialism in Spain, freeing Bolivia, Colombia, Panama, Ecuador, said in 1829, the United States seems by providence to be a plague of misery across the Americas. He was so correct. This policy is still being carried out, and we don't have time to list the many interventions in the name of liberty that the United States government, both Democrats and Republicans, have initiated against all of the countries in Latin America, Central America, as well as the Caribbean.
And you're mentioning Republicans and Democrats.
Yes.
And very few days ago, Jill Stein, the former presidential candidate for the Green Party, in a tweet, she wrote more or less that idea. He said, you don't have to forget that Democrats and Republicans could dispute inside the U.S., but in terms of foreign policy, they are just one voice, and all of them are in favor of the invasion or attacking Venezuela, and they have always been with Cuba and other things. So if you put that piece of information and you add it up with Noam Chomsky saying in the U.S. there is no 2 political parties, it's just one political party, the business party. Is this a democracy?
In very broad terms, they are accurate in their descriptions, and in very broad terms, this is fundamentally anti-democratic. But we must be careful to speak in very broad conceptual or theoretical terms. We must engage the day-to-day negotiation of power. I've been in the halls of Congress for the last few days talking to various congressional people in the Democratic Party, and we're seeing small breaks, very important breaks, with the Trump administration's policy against Venezuela. We're seeing Congress people who are now trying to push through legislation that there can be no military intervention there. We must take advantage of that, despite the general truth that they tend to historically stand in the same space. We're seeing people who are beginning to understand that sanctions are hurting all Venezuelans, and this
not only the government.
Not only the government. And some people are beginning to change their minds on this. So despite those general historical truths, we must deal with the actual day-to-day realities, and we must build this broad front, not around one individual leader, but around the principles that the majority of citizens, I think it's like 17 out of 20 elections in the last 20 years, some figure like that, have voted not just for an individual personality, but they voted for humanistic principles, and they voted for domestic and international policies that would help them improve material circumstances of their lives and to establish their own independence. We cannot dismiss that, again, no matter what we individually think politically.
In terms of strategy, we know that the presidency of Trump every day tried to make a headline so that the issue of Venezuela are still in the common radar. Next thing that they're trying to put is, quote unquote, humanitarian aid. How do you think they're going to play that card?
Well, first of all, we should be clear that people in Venezuela are suffering. They're suffering from food shortages, and they're suffering from medicines. And prior to the Trump administration's entrance to this, we have to also bring a critical eye to how the economic system was being managed, and recognize that the drop in oil prices also weaken the ability of the government to deal there. But in that context, this is not a serious humanitarian aid effort. A serious standard approach to this would be to go through the United Nations, not for the United States to come in as though they are the savior, or though the government of Colombia is a savior. And $40–50 million is not going to address that issue. So what the government of Venezuela is demanding is, yes, we will accept humanitarian aid, but take it through the standard protocols of nations, through the United Nations. Don't come in here to try to be our savior after you are strangling us by cutting us out of the international economic institutions where they might be able to help alleviate this. But the Maduro government should have addressed these issues of inflation and the like much earlier, and they may not be in such a dire situation. It does not mean that they would have been able to prevent U.S. intervention, because the United States is dead set on regime change of the Bolivarian Revolution, and in its present manifestation, the leadership of Nicolas Maduro.
And do you think that all that pressure eventually not only could end up asking or calling for elections or anticipated elections, but if that is not the case, then Maduro could rectify some of the economic policies?
Well, it's a hard question. They were not able to rectify the economic policies before this attack on them, so it is unclear whether within the present stewardship of the government there is the statecraft, the intellectual understanding of how to do that. Maduro has called for new elections of the National Assembly, but that will not be satisfactory. Pepe Mujica, one of the great statespeople from Uruguay, one of the great statespeople of our continent, has said that he is very concerned that we are now at a point of war or negotiations, that the United States is dead set on war. And so he, among others, are recommending that Maduro go to national elections under the monitoring of an international observatory system. That may be the only way out, because this puppet, and he is a puppet, he was not democratically elected to be president, Juan Guaido, is standing firm with the Boltons, and let's not forget Marco Rubio, who is really the chief strategist in the United States Congress, who is really giving strategic direction to the White House and to the State Department on this. So Maduro may have to move to elections. We must also watch very closely the debates within the Socialist Party of Venezuela, and where people are upholding national sovereignty, they are supporting that Maduro is a democratically elected president, but they're raising their critiques about the stewardship, not just how to preserve a singular figure.
And in the case of the humanitarian aid that we're talking about, also it has been mentioned that when Elliot Abrams, as you said, that he was the mastermind behind the Iran-Contras affair, yes, that throughout the excuse of the humanitarian aid, they were introducing guns or arms in Nicaragua. Could that be the case?
These people are vulgar. They are vile. They are irrational in preserving their own narrow view of how the world should work. So it very well could happen. But let us be clear that not only is there a military in Venezuela that is still supporting Maduro, with Russian advisors. There was a recent Russian airplane there. The Chinese have great investments around oil, but there are many, many armed citizens who are Chavistas there. And so this could turn into, as it did with the Iran-Contra affair, a bloody conflagration, and therefore these people must be stopped. Elliot Abrams is a war criminal. He's just not been put in prison. He was drummed out of Washington. He can no longer practice law. He lied to the U.S. Congress, and so this is why Democrats are stepping forward. I was on the Hill, and I've seen some Congress people who would put letters into the record calling him by name. The Washington Post has said you should not go down this road with Elliott Abrams. So people are beginning to be worried in the mainstream, who ordinarily would support this kind of action against Venezuela, that Donald Trump and Marco Rubio may be taking them down a road that they don't want to go.
Who is behind Guaido? Internally, meaning in Venezuela, and outside Venezuela?
Well, you know, one of the things that we have to think about, we have a tendency to talk about the abstract Venezuelan people, the abstract opposition, the abstract Chavistas. Juan Guaido is a part of the hardliners, the unwilling part of the opposition to go into respectful, peaceful negotiations. There are other sectors of the opposition that we need to hear from. Remembering that in the Dominican Republic not too long ago, they had reached an agreement, the opposition and the government of Maduro, and the United States came in and said no, and they put pressure on Spain. Leonel Fernandez, who's a great negotiator in our hemisphere, was involved centrally in that. So he is a dangerous puppet who has been saying the very same things that John Bolton has been saying, that Marcos Rubio has been saying. There is nothing nationalist about him. We will turn our oil, in effect, over to the United States. We will let the United States give us all of our reserves in the international arena. The Venezuelan people have not voted him in beyond the National Assembly that still exists, which is a questionable entity.
And if you look from overseas, the U.S., and then you see that members of the cabinet or the fishes that are really moving this agenda, we are talking about John Bolton, with the background is very questionable. Then we're talking Elliott Abrams. Then we're talking Marco Rubio. What is going on in the U.S. that these people are running the show? What is the message?
We, first of all, are generally a paralyzed population, notwithstanding the fact that we're seeing a shift in the culture of U.S. politics with all of these young adult millennials who are attaching themselves to social democracy, some very formally. And so that is a very hopeful sign that we'll be able to change. But we are a paralyzed country, very anti-democratic, with very proven dangerous, violent authoritarians like Pompeo. And Marco Rubio, again, has emerged as the statecrafter, as the strategic center of that. And therefore, this is why many people in the American public, some Republicans, some Democrats, different ideological perspectives, are petitioning members of Congress to put forth legislation, no U.S. military intervention. They are beginning to question the issue of sanctions, and they're beginning to move forward to say that this should be a negotiated political settlement.
You were mentioning Bolivia, and what they have already started is trying to make sure that they're going to wipe out also Evo Morales. And the thing is, his inscription as a candidate is illegal. Therefore, from then on, everything that is coming is going to be unconstitutional, illegal, given the fact that he's absolutely the favorite to win. We already say we are not ready to recognize. So the idea here, the strategy, is to wipe everything that has to do with left, with progressive governments, with progressive leaders?
Precisely. It is to seed the ground, to seed the consciousness of people across our hemisphere, including in the United States. Demonization and illegitimacy are really synonyms in this instance. And we must remember that it was the Obama administration who said that Venezuela was a threat to the United States. We must remember
to the national security.
To the national security. We must remember that it was Biden, the vice president, and Obama, who went to the CARICOM countries, who have stood bold, incidentally, and said to them, you should get off the Venezuelan oil and the Petrocaribe that Chavez's policy had put forth, but we're not going to give you oil. So this has been a bipartisan approach to overturning again the humanistic principles of the Bolivarian Revolution, the independence and sovereignty dating back to the 1800s with Simon Bolivar and the liberation forces. And of course, Haiti played the key role in helping Simon Bolivar in the liberation process. So this is not just about individuals. And of course, Cuba is on that list, and Nicaragua is an intensified attack from the United States government. And this is where we should stand up, because we know that Cuba is going to resist. And not just the government, not just the Communist Party, its citizens are going to resist. All of Latin America is going to be up in arms, everyday citizens, some very conservative, because they do not want other people to determine their sovereignty and determine their democratic process. And what we have is a blatant disregard for the basic elements of democracy, that is, of the citizens stepping forward to say, this is how we want to handle our governance, and this is the process, and this is the length of time. The United States is saying, no, it must be done now.
If you think that what is a strategy, the strategy, according to every single expert, is the U.S. cannot allow in his backyard a socialist government that could be successful, and therefore they're stick to the guns and using Elliot Abrams and company. They're ready to wake up at any price, even blood, even overthrowing the laws, the people, whatever. Is that right?
I think that is right, because it's a reflection of a global shift of power. The Chinese are all over Latin America. They're buying up oil all over the world. The Russians are able to bring an airplane in there, and the Russian foreign minister has stepped forward in the UN and says, you cannot go into Venezuela. So this is a slow shift of power in the world. The United States citizens must wake up, determine how do we adjust ourselves in peaceful, respectful negotiations with other countries with this changed geopolitical reality. And right now, we are pretty ignorant. Even the most educated and sophisticated of us in the United States don't understand these global shifts. We don't understand the hemisphere in which we live, and we must pay more attention. We must begin to move and align ourselves with progressive civic organizations in Latin America and progressive elected officials in the United States, like Marco Rubio talking to right-wing officials in Latin America. We must begin to talk to liberal and progressive administrators in order to stabilize our hemisphere and to stay within the protocols of nations to mediate our differences about principles and about policies.
James Arley, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.